Hi, everybody, and welcome to the newest episode of the HubSpot Agency Expert webinar series. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined on the line today by Jody Sutter. Jody is a new business expert with over 20 years of experience running business development teams for agencies large and small and spanning a diverse list of disciplines. They've included OMD, Havas Media, and the VIA agency. Jody is currently the owner of The Sutter Company, which is thesuttercompany.com. The Sutter Company is a consultancy that specializes in working with leadership at small ad agencies. She helps them identify and activate their natural talents for sales and marketing through programs that are easy to embrace because they take both the agency's strengths and available resources into consideration. So if at any stage you would like to join the conversation or ask us a burning question that you have, please feel free to tweet us at #AgencyExpertSeries. We'd love for you guys to get involved, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the conversation. So Jody, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, David. And it is a privilege and a pleasure to be here today. I really appreciate being part of this. I think HubSpot is a great organization and produces so much valuable content for the customers in its network. So it's really a pleasure to be a part of it. So today I am talking about a subject that is very close to my heart, and that's storytelling, and specifically how storytelling is a very easy and accessible way for you to engage with your prospects more effectively and win more new business. So I'm going to assume that today we've got an audience of mostly small to mid-size agencies. And in my practice, and I work a lot with small to mid-size agencies, what I found is that despite the fact that, our business lately, I think, has become somewhat fractured over the last few years, a lot of agencies that have emerged focusing on different things. There are probably a lot of agencies on the line today who focus on inbound marketing or digital marketing or social media marketing or database marketing. But despite that fracturing, the new business challenges that you guys face, they remain remarkably the same. And that's because advertising in almost all its forms is not about making widgets. It's not about a physical thing. So think about it. What's your output? Except in rare cases, it's not something physical that you can pick up and show to a prospect and then say, look, mine is bigger and stronger and faster and shinier. Your product tends to be ideas, concepts, processes, all stuff that's pretty abstract. And it is difficult for agencies to describe those intangible, abstract ideas and processes in tangible ways that will help your audience understand what they are and why they should value them. In fact, it's difficult for anyone to explain intangible things in tangible ways. But agencies, in their struggle to try to describe themselves and what they do and why they're valuable or different, to do that, many agencies tend to fall prey to jargon and generalizations that usually end up telling the prospect nothing. And that's why we tend to hear a lot of phrases, a lot of agencies that describe themselves like innovative or relentless or client-focused, or phrases like digital first or consumer at the core. Now, this is language that often gives the impression that it communicates effectively, but really this kind of stuff says very little, and often it says nothing at all. Now, this may sound familiar to you because if you yourselves have not been guilty of using a few of these words and phrases yourself, then I bet you've seen other agencies use them. And why do we do this? Well, I think the answer is as old as human evolution itself, or at least the evolution of our brain, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And I just want to also put forth a disclaimer. I'm not actually a brain scientist. I'm a new business expert, but brain science has a lot to do with effective pitching. So how did our brains evolve? Well, first came the lizard brain. And this is the oldest part of our brain. It's responsible for our most basic survival instincts, like aggression and fear. It's also the center for sensing basic pleasure. And it's also the place where all incoming messages stop first. They get stopped by the lizard brain, and then they're filtered before they move on. Now, the lizard brain, whose primary responsibility is the survival of the body, it takes its job very seriously, and that's a good thing. But it's not very good at high-level decision-making, and that can be a problem, as we'll see in a minute. Then as we evolved, into mammals, our midbrain or our mammal brain developed too. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions and socialization and bonding with each other. And then, as we evolved into primates, evolution gave us the neocortex. This is the most highly evolved part of our brain, and it's responsible for complex problem solving, reasoning, languages, and abstraction. There's that word again. Now, our thought processes mirror the evolution of our brain. When messages come our way, first we filter them using our lizard brain. Is this a dangerous message? Is this a fight or flight type of situation? Then they get filtered based on our social relationships, how we relate to that person delivering that message socially, and then problem solving. And here's where we face our challenge. When you pitch your agency to a new client or prospect, it means explaining those abstract concepts. And when you need to do that, when you need to create your pitch, you go straight to your problem-solving primate brain to ask for help. But the problem is that the pitch that your primate brain works so hard on and is so proud of, it's received by your prospect's lizard brain, and that causes a whole host of problems. And it's why I think a lot of pitches sound like this. Now, I'll admit that this actually came from a proposal from a client that I worked with several years ago, and I'll admit that this is not even the worst culprit, the most dense two paragraphs that I've ever seen. I've seen a lot worse. But really, what does this even mean? So as you take a few moments to read this, I want you to be honest with yourself about a few things. Number one, how hard are you having to work to read and comprehend this? And if you find yourself feeling a little resistance, does it leave you wanting to read more? Or does it have the opposite effect? And does it leave you wanting to kind of shut down and find something else that's more interesting? And then the third thing I want you to be honest with yourself is, does this sound like one of your pitches? When we transmit information that's vague or wordy or abstract, the lizard brain sees it as a threat. It says, this is going to require more work to comprehend than I want to invest, because it's going to siphon energy away from my primary function, which is to keep this body alive and intact. So one of two things is going to happen. Either the lizard brain will tell you to run, or it's going to tell you or the lizard brain is going to say, I'm going to radically summarize this information in order to save my energy for the basic survival of the body. It's going to radically summarize the information, and what happens then is you face the very high risk of that important parts of your message are going to be lost. So this becomes our challenge as business developers or salespeople or agency marketers. We have to make our information as easily accessible as possible. And as we know, we're already starting from a big disadvantage, because what we're selling is very abstract. Those ideas, those processes, those concepts. So if you want your pitch to be received friction-free, you have to quickly let the lizard brain know that there's no threat. In fact, that there might even be a little bit of pleasure for the lizard brain if it sticks around. And so how do you do that? Well, first you have to choose your messages carefully. You always want to keep it simple for the lizard brain. Don't try to fit too much into your pitch, whether that pitch is a quick elevator speech, a sales email, or something larger like a full-blown pitch presentation. I think a great rule of thumb is that you usually want to choose one message that you need to get across in any given pitch. If it's a full-blown pitch presentation, maybe you can choose up to 2 or 3. Keep your messages very focused, and of course, keep your messages tailored to your audience. Number 2, have an organizing principle. And I think this is especially true for larger, more complex pitches, like a presentation or like an RFP response. Now, these organizing principles can be as simple as beginning, middle, and end, very linear organizing principle. Or if you are pitching specific solutions to a client, you might be pitching them with an organizing principle that says, here's some near-term solutions, mid-term, and long-term solutions. Or it could even be pricing, cheap, moderately priced, expensive. And then number 3, you want to create an emotional connection. You want to get that lizard brain comfortable and passive so that your messages have a chance to get to the next level and appeal to the mammal brain, the part of the brain that rules social connections. So I wanted to give you now a recent example of how not creating an emotional connection can result in missed opportunities. I did some work recently with a small PR firm in the northeastern US. The CEO is a woman, and she's been in business for a long time. She has a great roster of clients. She has very strong word of mouth. She's based in a small city, so the people that she works with locally, they know her. They know her reputation. She's confident about the quality of work she delivers and what kinds of clients she serves best. She's starting from a great position. Recently, she had the opportunity to pitch a national organization whose mission it is to promote women-owned businesses. This was a government-issued RFP, so it also had a lot of requirements and hoops to jump through. And what I find with those types of RFPs is when you get into that really detailed stuff, it's very easy to focus on the details, the hoops that the client is asking you to jump through, and take your focus off the more emotional storytelling, the guidelines, these 3 guidelines that you have to remember when you're putting a pitch together for your client. Now, she thought she had an excellent chance to win this business. And frankly, based on the agency's experience and its capabilities, I agreed with her. But they lost. They didn't get the business. Someone else did. And since it was a government RFP, the organization had to be very transparent about why her agency didn't win the business. So, which was great, because I think we often don't get that type of honest, frank feedback from our clients or from our prospects when we don't win the pitch. But this time she did, and it wasn't good. Some of the factors that she had that should have been strongest for her, like her approach and her background, came back with a rating of marginal. Ouch. Okay, so this was a pitch that was basically hers to lose. And she got the feedback that her approach and her experience was marginal. So she called me up and she said, look, I'm in trouble here. I don't know why I lost this. I need you to help me make an assessment of what's going on. And when I took a look at her response, one of the biggest missed opportunities I saw was that she didn't link the agency's own journey as a woman-owned business to the mission of the organization. And the first question I said, why would they have neglected such an obvious seeming advantage? And I came up with 2 reasons. The only 2 I could really imagine were, 1, that the agency felt like maybe this was going to be pandering to the client. Or 2, is it possible that the agency overlooked such an obvious advantage? And in the end, I think it was a combination of both, which was really a shame, because my theory is that had she capitalized on the agency's own experience, it would have added a personal touch that the response really lacked. And assuming that the reviewers were also all or mostly women, since it was a women-focused organization, then it would have given her a chance to connect with the audience in a really authentic and a relevant and emotional way. It also would have communicated a sense of personality, which really would have helped the response too. It would have given the agency some license to show a bit of passion towards the organization's mission. So for instance, to tie in personal stories about the triumphs and frustrations of being a women-owned business in the US today. Now, I can also understand if the agency felt like this response, since it was a response to a government-issued RFP, if maybe it wasn't the right place to show passion. But I'd also suggest that the readers of this response are still human beings, even if they're also government wonks. And whether those readers are going to admit it or not, human beings are always susceptible to being moved by passion or a sense of mission and a good story. So it brings us to storytelling. I think storytelling is going to get you off the crack cocaine of wordiness, jargon, and generalizations that are so often common part of agency pitches. It's also going to help you transform those abstract descriptions that you struggle with about who you are and what you do into something tangible and relatable to the audience. The bottom line is that stories go down easy in a way that bullet points and facts and figures simply don't. So let's talk a little bit about storytelling. We've been relying on this thing, storytelling, to make sense of our confusing, complex, and contradictory world almost for as long as we've had a brain, for as long as we've used cave paintings to express ourselves. And there's lots of scientific research that's been done recently that shows that when our brains act differently when we interact or we hear or read a story. Our brains actually fire up in certain ways, and we do something subconsciously, and that is we seek to relate the stuff in that story to our own experience, and that creates an emotional connection. So, what makes a good story? Well, number one, may seem kind of obvious, every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every story has a protagonist, and that's someone or something or a group of individuals that propel the story forward. There's always something at stake. So it could be money, it could be love, it could be the preservation of the human race. And there are always surprises and setbacks. And these are events that draw us in and make us root for a particular outcome. So I'm going to get a little more like story geeky on you here. And let's talk about how these work on a classic story arc. What are those points on the story arc that make a good story? Well, first of all, every story is this interplay between struggle and triumph over the course of a period of time. It starts out with stasis, where essentially things have been relatively the same for an extended period of time. And then that stasis is broken by some kind of trigger event. And that trigger event then propels the protagonists forward. And the protagonists then move into their quest stage, where essentially they're actually looking to try to regain that stasis that was lost by the trigger event. And during the quest, they are going to meet a series of surprises and setbacks. And then they're going to get to a point where they have to make a critical choice. And usually that choice is going to be a difficult choice. And usually that choice will result in their world never really being the same again. And that critical choice continues to propel the protagonist forward, and you continue to experience surprises and setbacks, and it leads then to the moment of highest tension, that climactic moment of the story. From there, we go to the moment of reversal, when the protagonist or protagonists realize that because of the quest, they may be fundamentally changed, and yet they may be fundamentally the same, and yet they've also changed in some deeper way, maybe spiritually or psychically. And then the story is, if it's a good story, is tied up in a nice little bow at the end, resolved, whether happy ending or sad ending. It's resolved in some way that's satisfying to the reader or the viewer. So this is pretty abstract, and as we've already established, abstract things are harder to understand. So I'm going to make this a little more tangible for you by showing you how this works with a story that I think we're all going to be familiar with, and that is the movie version of The Wizard of Oz. So think about Dorothy in Kansas. She's living her humdrum life, and she's wishing she could explore beyond her backyard. Remember that at the very beginning of the movie, the song "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," as she yearns for exploring the world. And the filmmakers even emphasized her humdrum life by filming it in black and white. And then comes that trigger event, the tornado. It lifts her and her dog Toto up into the unknown and lands her in the magical world of Oz. So no more black and white, right? This is full-blown Technicolor. And from here, she then goes on a series, she goes on her quest to regain that stasis. She goes on her quest to get back home. And on that quest, she meets with a lot of surprises and setbacks until she comes to Oz. So when she gets to the Emerald City, she meets the wizard. And the wizard is kind of it causes them all to cower. He's a pretty intimidating being. And she asks him if he will help her get home. And he's not very encouraging. And what he actually says to her is, before I'm even going to think about helping you get home, you have to do something for me. And here's where the critical choice comes in. He says, you need to retrieve for me the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. So that's a crazy thing to ask poor little Dorothy, this little girl from humdrum Kansas, to go and essentially steal the most important possession of the evilest person in the land of Oz. But Dorothy does have a choice. So she could decide that the Emerald City isn't such a bad place after all. Maybe she'd like to stick around. But of course she doesn't. She decides that in order to get home, she has to go. She has to accept the challenge. And so she goes on her way. And it's not an easy trip, of course. And after some additional terrifying surprises and setbacks, including flying monkeys and death threats, Dorothy and her friends all find them captured. And after the witch says sadistically to Dorothy that she is going to see her friends and her dog die, so the witch takes a torch and starts to light the scarecrow. So Dorothy, of course, her instant reaction is to try to save her friend. She takes a bucket of water to put out the scarecrow, and of course the water also douses the Wicked Witch. And as we all know, the Wicked Witch perishes. She melts. Ding dong, the witch is dead. So Dorothy then triumphantly takes the charred broomstick back to the wizard, who, another surprise and setback, isn't actually a wizard at all. But luckily, he says he can still get her back to Kansas. But Dorothy has one more setback to get through, and it's a big one. As she and Toto are in the hot air balloon with the wizard, who's actually not a wizard at all, and they're ready to lift off, Toto sees a cat in the crowd of people who have gathered, and he jumps out of the hot air balloon. And Dorothy, of course, jumps out after Toto. She's not going to leave Oz without her beloved dog. But it's too late for the balloon to come back. And the wizard, not wizard, continues to lift up into the air and says, I'm sorry, I can't come back. And so it looks like Dorothy probably won't get back to Kansas, which is pretty tragic because it means that that arduous journey that she just went through, that quest to regain her stasis, was probably all for naught. Until, of course, Glinda the Good Witch shows up. And what Glinda says is that Dorothy, despite the journey she's just been on, that Dorothy has always had the power to get back home. So all Dorothy needs to do is click her heels 3 times and say, there's no place like home. So Dorothy is the same person in body, but she's changed in some way. This quest has made her realize that anything she could ever want is actually contained within her world. And she wakes up, of course, back in canvas, back in black and white. Her friends and family are around her, and it's a great story, and it continues to be a classic. So what about you? You guys this may have been an entertaining interlude, but what does this have to do with ad agency or agency new business? Well, I think that there are so many stories that surround you and your agency, and it's just a matter of identifying them and learning how to tell them better. And how do you do that? So before we move on from the story arc, let's take a look at how it works with a standard piece of agency new business content, and that is the case study. So with your case study, it usually starts with some sort of situation. We started working with this client, they had been doing business just fine, and then something happened. There's that trigger event, and that is often takes the form of the challenge. And that challenge can be that new competitors have entered into the marketplace, the economy is bad, technology is making it difficult, Amazon Amazon is playing a role in deteriorating CPG companies, whatever that challenge may be. And so the client comes to you, the agency, and says, here's my challenge. Will you go on that quest with us to help us solve the challenge? And you say, of course we will. And your quest begins maybe with a little bit of research. You pore over the data, maybe you do some research yourself. It takes a long time, it can be difficult. You have to have a lot of faith that you're going to see some sort of insight is going to arise. And out of that insight maybe comes that big idea. And it's risky. You got to present that big idea to your client. Will they like it? Will they not? And then from there, let's say they love it. You still then have to actually produce it, right? So then you go into creative development. And maybe that's a bit of a setback because you've just presented this fabulous big idea that is, probably going to be impossible to produce. Maybe because you have no budget, or maybe because it's relying on new technology that isn't very tested. So you go back into your quest, your creative development, the execution of the assets for this campaign, and then the big day, the campaign launch. And then we go into that moment of reversal, and that's again back with the story of Dorothy. That's when she realized that while she's still the same person, she doesn't really need to go beyond her own backyard to find everything she needs in life. So this moment of reversal can be a little bit tricky in these types of case studies, but it's so important. And I think that ideally your moment of reversal is when you can point to some kind of shift, ideally at your client or at your own agency. So what kind of shift might that be? Well, that maybe is, that shift can take the form of, say, let's go back to that idea of a new technology. You've pitched this idea of relying on a new technology for this campaign, and your client has resisted. It's a scary thing, it's untested, maybe it's expensive, but you've managed to be persuasive enough, and you've managed to overcome those setbacks and have them agree to do it. And let's say that it was wildly successful, and it was so successful that perhaps the client can't quite understand how they could have lived without that technology before. So there's some shift at the client. Because of the good work that you did, they have now fundamentally changed because they're probably always going to use this technology in the near future for their campaigns. Or maybe it's a shift at your agency. How has your agency changed, grown, or evolved as a result of working with this client? And then, of course, there are the results. And this can be a tricky thing as well, because sometimes you don't always get the client to give you the results, right? And that's something that we can talk about. Maybe it'll be a topic for an entirely different web clinic or webinar. But ideally, you want to start out your assignment with your client with some clear benchmarks so that you can talk about the results at the end. So taking a look at this here, you can see that all those elements, all those things that go into every good story are all here. The form is the same. The challenge plus solution plus results is equal to a story's beginning, middle, and end. There's a protagonist, which is always the client. And yes, you're on a quest with that client, but your team is like the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion to the client's Dorothy. You are helping, enabling, and supporting. Of course, there's something at stake. Usually it's revenue or market share. Sometimes it's the client's reputation. And unless someone out there can prove to me that they've mastered a frictionless creative process, then there are always surprises and setbacks. And like in The Wizard of Oz, or like in any good story, it's really the surprises and the setbacks that make the case study interesting and relatable. So you might be asking, well, why would I want to spend time talking about the setbacks? Well, here's why. If you're targeting the right kinds of clients, then they're going to be seeing themselves in that story. They're probably going to be recognizing the same surprises and setbacks that they've dealt with or are struggling with now. So by telling them the surprises and the setbacks, about those surprises and setbacks that you have met and overcome in the past, well, it offers proof to them that you can help find solutions to their problems. It also tells your prospect things like that you are perseverant, that you're innovative, that you're relentless, that you're client-focused, that you're committed to your work. And all those words and phrases, they may sound familiar because I mentioned a few at the beginning of this webinar, but all those words and phrases on their own sound empty and meaningless, unless, of course, you have a story to back them up. So by telling them a good story, you're actually telling them all those things that you want them to know without having to rely on those empty and meaningless sounding words and phrases. So let's recap this for a minute. Storytelling is like a magic key that unlocks the brain. It also makes it easier for you, the teller of the story or the seller of the idea, because you as a human being also have that innate ability to tell a story. It's a skill that you were born with. There's really nothing difficult about it. You just have to trust your abilities and be willing to let go of the jargon and the generalizations and tell a good story. And here are two more reasons. First one is stories are memorable. Now, if you think about it, I think sometimes this is also something that's forgotten. Your pitch is going to be so much more effective if it can last beyond that first phone call or meeting. And the easiest way for your prospect to remember your pitch is going to be if it's in the form of the story, or if there are stories that are woven into it that make it easy for their lizard brain, for it to get through the lizard brain and make the more emotional parts, the more cognitive parts of your brain latch onto that. So, and if stories are memorable, it also means that stories are repeatable. And usually it's not just one person at your client organization that is that's making the decision on whether to hire you or not. Usually it's a team. Sometimes that person has to justify their decision to their boss. So by interweaving stories into your pitch, you're actually giving your client a tool to use to sell you through to their management, to the people who have to approve their decision. So I'm going to give you one more example of how that works. There's a book called Made to Stick. It's by Chip and Dan Heath. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it. Its premise is that all good sticky ideas share common characteristics. And to make this point, they use urban myths as an example. You probably all know what urban myths are. Those are those stories that seem like they should be unlikely, except for the fact that your friend or coworker who told you about it said it actually happened to their college roommate's brother or their neighbor's sister-in-law. So in the book, the Heaths talk about the kidney heist. And if you know this story, if these two words prompt a story in your head and your memory, then I bet the basic details came back to you fairly quickly and without effort. It probably wasn't hard to remember. So for those of you who don't remember, or who don't know what the story is, the basic story goes, a businessman visiting a city that's not his own on a business trip. He decides to go down to the hotel bar for a nightcap before going to bed, and he's sitting at the bar. Maybe he's texting with his wife or checking his email, and this beautiful woman sits near him and strikes up a friendly conversation and offers to buy him a drink. And he thinks, oh, you know, what the heck? It's not that late. She's kind of pretty. She's entertaining. So he accepts the drink, and the next thing he knows, he's waking up in a bathtub filled with ice. And scrawled on the mirror above the sink in red lipstick, it says, "Don't panic, an ambulance is on its way. Your kidney has been stolen." So if you're familiar with the story, you may have heard it with different variations, but typically it always has the common elements of the drug drink, the ice-filled bathtub, and the fact that the person's kidney has been stolen. It's memorable, right? And to be fair, because it's memorable, because it's filled with a lot of lurid details that we human beings love, but don't always have a place in a new business pitch. but I think you can still use the basic storytelling principles on which those urban myths rely to make your pitch memorable and repeatable. And I'm going to bring back these two sentences, and just so we can make a quick comparison. And again, you could say it's not fair because Kidney Heist is such a lurid story, but how memorable are you? Just remember that a confused mind always says no. A confused mind is ruled by the lizard brain, and it does one of three things. When something is boring, the lizard brain says ignore it. When something seems dangerous, the lizard brain says fight or run. And when something is complicated, it says, I'm going to radically summarize this information, which will inevitably cause information to be lost. And then the lizard brain is going to pass it on in severely weakened and truncated form. So it bears repeating. Storytelling is such a powerful tool. It makes it easy for your prospects to understand what makes you valuable. It makes it easy for them to relate to you and to remember and to repeat to others what they liked about you and why they want to hire you. So as you start to trust your storytelling capacity, you can try using it on case studies and maybe try using it on more challenging formats like prospecting emails or even tweets. And trust me, if all the elements of a good story can be packed into 140 characters or less, and if you don't believe me, I'm going to leave you with this final story. And it's about Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway once bet that he could write a 6-word story that could make people cry. The wager was $10, which Hemingway won with the following: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Now, I hope your stories will never be as tragic as that, but they can make a similar impact. So trust your innate ability to connect with your prospects, who are, after all, other human beings who just want to hear a good story. So I hope that you guys got a lot out of this today. I think that this is all very doable on your own, but if this is something that's intriguing to you and you're not quite sure how to transform your sales and marketing messaging, then I welcome you to contact me. We can set up a quick 10 or 15-minute phone call, and we can explore ways that maybe I can help you out. Or there might be some things that I can answer right now.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks so much for that brilliant presentation, Jody. I'm sure our listeners will agree. And I must say, it was definitely one of the most enjoyable presentations we've had on the series. It was,
thank you.
It was really, really great to listen to. And I'm sure there's a lot of kind of actionable and helpful kind of insights that you shared that our listeners can go away and apply to their own marketing efforts. So yeah, now is the time for anybody who has any further burning questions to tweet us and ask us at #AgencyExpertSeries. Any questions that you might have for myself or Jody, and we can try and get to them before we finish. I have a couple here, Jody, if you want to get cracking.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. So the first one is about stories and how do we know if our stories are compelling? What advice would you have there?
Well, how do we know? Well, first of all, I think this is where I think the trust has to come in. If you are able to check the boxes, and if you can look at your stories, like your case studies, and you can see if all those elements are there, does it have a clear beginning, middle, and end? In other words, is there a linear form that draws people through? Is there an organizing principle that makes that lizard brain feel comfortable? Is there a protagonist? Are you clearly stating what your client's challenge is? Are you showing them are you being honest about the surprises and setbacks? So if all those elements are there, and you can even go back to the story arc. And by the way, I'd be happy to make this presentation available to anyone who wants to send me an email. I'll give it to them. Can you start to plot those points on the story arc onto your case study, for example, or agency history or team bio? So I guess my point is, if your case study, for instance, can pass that test of those essential elements and the points on the story arc, then you've got a compelling story. And that's where you have to just trust that it's there.
Great. That sounds good. So the second question I have here is a scenario. So for example, say I join a marketing agency and I'm new to the agency.
Okay.
My predecessor has left some work on my desk, and I've inherited a lot of his stuff that sounds very like the tone of that agency paragraph that you shared at the beginning.
Right. Yeah.
Where would you say that I should start to make that better? What advice would you have for someone like me?
Yeah. So the first thing I would do is really take a big step back, because sometimes I think one of the basic foundational things that you also need in place in order to tell a good story is a strong positioning. And often agencies don't have that either. So the first thing to do is to take a step back and say, is the agency already being clear about what it does, what it offers, and who it serves best? And if the answer is no, then you got to figure that out first. And if the answer is yes, then that also provides you that sort of that basic filter through which you can take a look at that marketing material. And probably what you want to do is prioritize things. So I think, I would argue the case study is probably one of the most important pieces of new business content that is used, that can effectively be used to convert clients. So maybe you want to start with the top 5 to 10 case studies that you use regularly. But you also want to take a look at your agency history. Take a look at those core messaging, those core things that you're using to describe your agency. The other thing that you want to try to do, and it does take a little bit of time, so I won't pretend that this is something that's an easy fix or something you can do in a day. But make sure then that story is told consistently. So it's fantastic to go through and rewrite your case studies, the ones that you use most frequently and the ones that are most effective, to include some storytelling elements. But then make sure that, well, first of all, make sure that the case studies that you include, say, in your proposals are consistent with the case studies that you're showing on your website. And then make sure you don't neglect all the other messaging that surrounds your sales efforts, so that you don't want to pair a really strong case study with a really lackluster agency description or agency history.
Great. Thanks so much, Jody. So the third question we have here is from Mariad Mall, who is sending greetings from Serbia.
Hello.
And Mariad is wondering about the sincerity of stories and how to, I suppose, come across as sincere and make sure that you are driving home your point of your story while coming across sincere and making it come across not fake. So I think that goes back to the trust element that you've already spoken about. What advice would you have about sincerity in stories? It's remarkably similar to what I had said, is if those elements are there, I think where stories are inauthentic is when stories aren't true. So if they're true to you, then it's going to be a good story. Mm-hmm. A lot of times I think, especially in, I'm just going to use like a pitch presentation when you've got maybe half an hour, 60 minutes to sit down in front of a client. I think one of the most effective ways to start those presentations is with that story. And if you are at this point, it's really important at this point to create that emotional connection, to make the people in the room feel safe about you, to soften them up with a little bit of the story about why you started the agency, if you're the CEO or founder that's presenting it. Even stories behind why or who you hire. Is it because you made bad mistakes in the past? Is it because you're committed to offer people certain types of people opportunities? Are you committed to creating an agency that excels in a certain service, a certain area of expertise? So I think it's the authenticity, or the compelling stories come from authenticity. And I guess going back to what I'd said, don't shy away from exploring some of those setbacks. Some of those things that you may want to hide are things that you probably actually want to showcase. Some of those things that make you a little vulnerable. And of course you want to position yourself, you want to show yourself in the best and most positive light. But often it's, it's the way that it's the problems that you've faced and the way that you've overcome those challenges makes you a more interesting, more compelling partner. Yeah, absolutely. I think those vulnerable pieces of the story that you mentioned
Yeah.
are probably the most human, and I think it's the human
Yeah.
element that people buy into the most.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another question we have here is about the formal element of business and whether or not storytelling is a little bit informal, I should say, for
Right.
certain business situations. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah. So again, I think I would go back to this idea that storytelling is so much more impactful than using facts and figures. So, and I think this is also what happened to my client, my PR client, the woman-owned PR agency. I think that's the decision that she had made, that she said to herself, you know what, this is a government issued RFP, and it means that I need to be serious and businesslike and buttoned up. And in fact, if you had asked the client, like if you said to the client, like, hey, how serious should they be? Should they tell you a bunch of stories, or should they give you facts and figures? The client might even have said, well, no, of course we want facts and figures. We want to make a very logical and measured assessment of the responses. But the fact is, like I said, they're also human beings, and so they're very susceptible to being moved by a good story. And they're susceptible to connecting emotionally through a good story. I would also think, I think the other thing that we do sometimes as well is we look at these client-issued documents, RFPs or briefs, and they're not terribly good storytellers either. So they rely on this really dry language, and we make the mistake thinking that we need to respond back in the same way. So I'm not saying not to be businesslike, but I'm saying that stories definitely do have a place in businesslike language.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Jody, that's all the questions we have for today.
Okay.
I want to say thank you so much for joining us, Jody. As I say, it was definitely one of the most enjoyable presentations.
Oh, good.
Series. I've really enjoyed it, and
Great.
I think it definitely has a lot of actionable insights that people can take away and apply to their own efforts, as mentioned earlier. Yeah. Thanks to everybody who's joined us. We have a large crowd who's tuned in, so thanks to everybody for being here and engaging with us. And we're going to be hosting another episode of this series on the 8th of November with Mr. John Gleason, and he'll be talking about client practices and behaviors and how these factors impact how clients see, engage, and interact with agencies. So Jody, thanks so much again.
Thank you very much, David. It was a real pleasure. I hope I can do it again sometime soon.
Absolutely. I just want to remind people that Jody at thestuttercompany.com, I should say, is the email address where they can get your slides. Is that correct?
Yes, just send me an email and I will get them out. It may take me a couple of days, but I promise all emails will be responded to.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Jody, thanks again. And to everybody that's been here, thanks so much. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.